The courtroom fell silent. Judge Robert Wilson, no stranger to surprises, never expected to hear what came next. Two black girls stood up, their eyes locked on him. "We are your daughters," they said in unison. Robert felt his breath catch. Those words would change his life forever. What do you think happens next? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this incredible story. The sun was just beginning to rise over Birmingham, Alabama, painting the city's skyline in hues of gold and crimson. A young Robert Wilson stood at the bus stop, clutching a second-hand briefcase. His suit, freshly pressed by his mother the night before, didn't quite fit his lanky frame, but it was the best they could afford. At just 22, Robert was already familiar with the sting of prejudice. Growing up in the Deep South, he had seen how society's expectations for a black boy like him extended no further than factory work or a janitor's uniform. But Robert had bigger dreams, dreams that were mocked by neighbors, doubted by teachers, and outright dismissed by the world around him. His decision to attend law school had been met with ridicule. "What does a black boy know about the law?" one professor had sneered during his undergraduate studies. His classmates, most of whom came from wealthy, white families, often treated him as invisible, or worse, a target for their subtle jabs. When he graduated near the top of his class, no one clapped for him at the ceremony. Yet Robert never let their silence deter him. The real challenges began when he started working as a clerk for Judge Harold Green, one of the few white judges sympathetic to civil rights. Every day, Robert navigated a minefield of microaggressions and outright hostility. Colleagues questioned his intelligence, calling him "boy" in a condescending tone. Some even sabotaged his work, misplacing important files or altering schedules without telling him. But Robert always found a way to rise above, working twice as hard to prove he deserved to be there. The turning point came during a high-profile civil rights case. Judge Green assigned Robert to prepare a brief on behalf of a group of black workers suing their employer for discriminatory practices. As Robert delved into the case, he uncovered a web of lies, bribes, and cover-ups that painted a damning picture of systemic racism. When the case went to trial, his meticulous research became the backbone of the plaintiff's argument, ultimately leading to a landmark victory. The win drew attention to Robert's legal brilliance but also made him a target for those who saw him as a threat to the status quo. Determined to make a greater impact, Robert decided to run for judge. His campaign was an uphill battle. Opponents used every tactic to discredit him, digging into his personal life, fabricating scandals, and plastering the city with posters that read, "A black judge? Not in our court." He was called slurs during debates, his house was vandalized, and his family received anonymous threats. But Robert remained unshaken. He knew the fight wasn't just for him, it was for every black child who dared to dream of a better future. On election night, the results were closer than anyone had anticipated. When the final tally declared him the winner, Robert sat in stunned silence. Tears welled in his eyes as he thought of his late father, who had worked tirelessly as a janitor to provide for the family, and his mother, who had always told him he could reach the stars if he just worked hard enough. Becoming a judge was only the beginning. The bench wasn't a place of prestige, it was a battlefield. Every ruling Robert made was scrutinized, every decision questioned. Lawyers would openly challenge his authority, and some even refused to address him as "Your Honor." But Robert faced every challenge head-on, driven by an unshakable belief in justice. He earned the nickname Iron Judge for his unwavering commitment to fairness, but behind the scenes, the cost was heavy. He sacrificed relationships, endured relentless scrutiny, and carried the weight of being the first black judge in a district steeped in racism. Yet, for every door slammed in his face, Robert pushed open another. This chapter of his life laid the foundation for the storm that was about to come, a storm that would test his resolve, his beliefs, and his very identity. But Robert Wilson had always thrived in the face of adversity, and he wasn't about to back down now. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the high-profile case of Collins versus Bradford Steelworks began. It was Robert Wilson's first major trial as a judge, and all eyes were on him, not because of his reputation, but because of the color of his skin. The case was simple in its premise but explosive in its implications. A group of black steelworkers had accused their employer of decades-long discrimination, including unequal pay, hazardous working conditions, and wrongful terminations. The plaintiffs sat on one side of the room, tired, worn down by years of injustice but resolute in their pursuit of fairness. On the other side sat the Bradford Steelworks legal team, a small army of polished attorneys representing one of the wealthiest corporations in the state. Behind them sat the company's CEO, George Bradford III, a man who epitomized privilege, his smirk a constant reminder of his confidence in the system's bias. Robert adjusted his black robe as he took his seat at the bench. The chatter in the courtroom died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. He could feel the eyes of the spectators drilling into him, waiting for him to slip. The local newspapers had already stoked the flames, with headlines like, "Can justice be fair when the judge isn't?" and "The wrong color on the bench?" As the trial unfolded, it became clear that the case was more than a legal battle, it was a referendum on Robert's legitimacy as a judge. Every objection he sustained in favor of the plaintiffs was met with sneers from the defense attorneys and murmurs from the audience. Every ruling he made for the steel company was greeted with silent disappointment from the workers. No matter what he did, someone accused him of bias. The pivotal moment came during the cross-examination of a key witness, Mary Simmons, a former HR manager at Bradford Steelworks. Her testimony confirmed that upper management had implemented a secret policy to phase out black workers by fabricating reasons for termination. As she described the directive, her voice trembled, and she refused to make eye contact with the defense team. "Your Honor," the lead defense attorney interrupted. "I object to this line of questioning. It's speculative and irrelevant." Robert leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Objection overruled. The witness may continue." That ruling set the room ablaze. Bradford's legal team exchanged venomous glances, while the CEO glared at Robert with barely concealed rage. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, some in support of the workers, others brandishing signs that read, "Impartiality dies here," and "Send the activist judge home." The trial dragged on for weeks, and Robert's household became a war zone. Anonymous letters filled with racial slurs and death threats arrived daily. One morning, he found a noose hanging from the oak tree in his front yard. The police took a report but offered little protection, leaving Robert and his family to live in constant fear. As the case neared its conclusion, the evidence against Bradford Steelworks was overwhelming. The plaintiff's attorney delivered a fiery closing argument, pleading for justice not just for his clients but for every marginalized worker who had ever been silenced. The defense, on the other hand, relied on subtle dog whistles, suggesting that the plaintiffs were simply looking for a payout and implying that Robert's rulings were racially motivated. When the jury delivered a guilty verdict against Bradford Steelworks, the courtroom erupted. The plaintiffs hugged one another, tears streaming down their faces. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, Robert's home was vandalized. Windows were shattered, graffiti scrawled across the walls reading, "Traitor to justice," and "Black robes, black bias." The message was clear: his role in the case would not be forgotten or forgiven by those who felt he had overstepped his place. The backlash spread beyond his neighborhood. Prominent politicians and business leaders called for his impeachment. Anonymous editorials accused him of being unfit to rule impartially. Robert became a symbol of both hope and hatred, his name invoked in protests and whispered in conspiracy-laden circles. The first tragedy of his career wasn't just the hate he endured, it was the realization that, no matter how fair or just he was, many would see him as nothing more than a black man in a seat they thought he didn't deserve. The price of justice was heavy, and it was one Robert would pay over and over again. The corridors of the courthouse were eerily quiet as Judge Robert Wilson walked to his chambers. He carried an air of calm professionalism, but inside, he was anything but at ease. The victory in Collins versus Bradford Steelworks had made him a hero to many, but it had also painted a target on his back. Beneath the veneer of civility in his workplace, an insidious network of powerful adversaries was quietly working to bring him down. It began subtly. Files Robert needed for upcoming cases would mysteriously go missing, only to reappear too late for him to review them thoroughly. Clerks and assistants, who once greeted him with smiles, now avoided eye contact. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, his name often paired with words like activist and biased. Colleagues he had considered allies grew distant, their silence more telling than any insult. One evening, Robert stayed late in his chambers, combing through documents for an upcoming case. A knock at the door startled him. It was Judge Arthur Conway, a senior judge with a reputation for being both influential and ruthless. Conway entered without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "Robert," Conway began, his tone dripping with feigned concern, "you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest with that Bradford case." "I did what the law demanded," Robert replied evenly, though he could feel the tension tightening his chest. Conway chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You're new to this bench, so let me give you some advice. Sometimes the law isn't about what's right, it's about what keeps the system running smoothly. And right now, you're a cog out of place." Robert met Conway's gaze, unflinching. "If being in the right place means turning a blind eye to injustice, then I'll gladly stay out of sync." Conway's expression hardened. "Watch yourself, Wilson. You might think you're untouchable, but you've made powerful enemies. They won't just let this go." The warning lingered in the air long after Conway left. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. In the weeks that followed, the pressure intensified. Anonymous complaints flooded the Judicial Review Board, accusing Robert of partiality and misconduct. Most were baseless, but the sheer volume of them raised enough suspicion for an investigation to be opened. His every ruling was scrutinized, his every word dissected. The media played its part, publishing op-eds questioning whether activist judges like Robert had a place in the judiciary. Behind the scenes, the campaign against him was orchestrated by a coalition of influential figures. Politicians, corporate leaders, and even some of his fellow judges conspired to undermine him. They called secret meetings, planted stories in the press, and encouraged frivolous appeals to clog his docket and frustrate his efforts to deliver justice. The most personal attack came in the form of a fabricated scandal. An anonymous tip led to a front-page article accusing Robert of accepting bribes during his time as a lawyer. The story was thin on evidence but rich in insinuations, enough to tarnish his reputation. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, waving signs that read, "Corrupt and biased," and "Impeach the activist judge." One evening, as Robert drove home, his car was forced off the road by a black SUV. The vehicle sped away before he could get a clear look at the driver, but the message was clear: back down, or face the consequences. When he reported the incident, the police seemed uninterested, brushing it off as a random act of road rage. Robert's family also became targets. His wife, Grace, received threatening phone calls, and his teenage son was harassed at school. One day, his daughter came home crying, clutching a note someone had slipped into her locker: "Your daddy thinks he's better than us. We'll show him he's not." Through it all, Robert refused to yield. He doubled down on his commitment to fairness, delivering rulings that were measured, impartial, and grounded in the law. Yet the weight of the attacks was undeniable. Late at night, in the solitude of his study, he would sit in silence, his hands trembling as he tried to process the enormity of what he was facing. The turning point came when a trusted clerk, Angela, approached him with evidence of a coordinated effort to have him removed from the bench. She had overheard a conversation between Conway and a state senator, discussing plans to fabricate further charges against Robert. "You need to be careful," Angela whispered, her voice quivering with fear. "They won't stop until you're gone." Robert thanked her, but his resolve only deepened. He knew the system wasn't built for people like him, it was built to keep them out. But he also knew that every step he took forward paved the way for others to follow. The enemies in the shadows could scheme and threaten all they wanted. Robert had faced worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let them win. As the chapter closed, Robert prepared for the fight of his life, knowing that the cost of standing his ground might be more than he was willing to pay. But if justice demanded a sacrifice, he would give it, because, in his heart, he knew it was the only way to truly change the system. The knock at Robert's office door was sharp and unexpected, cutting through the silence of his late evening paperwork. He looked up, his pen paused mid-signature, and called out, "Come in." The door opened slowly, revealing a woman he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Sandra Matthews. She stepped inside with a confidence that belied the storm brewing in her eyes. Her hair, once a wild cascade of curls, was now sleek and tied back. She wore a tailored suit, but no amount of polished professionalism could mask the raw emotion etched into her face. For a moment, Robert couldn't speak. Memories surged back with the force of a tidal wave. Their shared history was one he had buried deep, a chapter of his life marked by passion, heartbreak, and regret. "Sandra," he finally managed, his voice low and cautious. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the door behind her and took a seat across from his desk. Her hands rested on her lap, but he noticed the faint tremor in her fingers. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of urgency. "It's about them." Robert's brow furrowed. "Them?" he repeated, unsure of what she meant. Sandra leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Our daughters." The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Robert leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Daughters?" The word felt foreign, like an accusation wrapped in confusion. He had no children, or so he had believed. His thoughts flashed back to the summer they had shared all those years ago. Sandra had been a paralegal at the time, sharp-witted and ambitious, with a laugh that could light up a room. Robert, fresh out of law school and still finding his footing, had been instantly drawn to her. Their connection had been electric, their chemistry undeniable. But their relationship had existed in the shadow of a world that was far less accepting. Their love was a secret, whispered in late-night conversations and stolen moments. Sandra, too, was black, but her light skin and green eyes often allowed her to pass in a society obsessed with labels. Her family, deeply entrenched in respectability politics, had disapproved of Robert from the start. "He's too loud," her mother had said. "Too radical. He'll bring nothing but trouble." The breaking point had come when Sandra discovered she was pregnant. She had told Robert one evening after dinner, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. But instead of the joy she had hoped for, his reaction had been one of panic. "How can we raise a child in this world?" he had asked, his voice tinged with despair. "Do you know what they'll face?" "What will face?" Sandra had interpreted his fear as rejection, and in the heat of the argument that followed, she made a decision. She left him. No note, no goodbye, just an empty apartment and a broken heart. Robert had searched for her, but she had vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Now, sitting across from her, Robert struggled to find the words. "Sandra, why now? Why come back after all this time?" She hesitated, her composure faltering for the first time. "Because they need you, Robert," she said softly. "They deserve to know where they come from. And whether you're ready or not, they're ready to meet you." His chest tightened. "And you didn't think I deserved to know about them? All these years, Sandra? You just decided for me?" Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flashed. You didn't exactly make it easy for me to stay, she shot back. I was terrified, Robert. Terrified of being alone, of raising two girls in a world that didn't want them. And you were too busy worrying about the big picture, to see what we had right in front of us. Her words cut deep, but Robert knew she wasn't wrong. He had let his fear of the world's cruelty overshadow his ability to embrace the love they had shared. Sandra reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the desk. Robert's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the image. Two girls, no older than 8, stood side by side, their matching smiles a perfect blend of Sandra's features and his own. Their dark curls framed their faces, and their eyes, bright and determined, seemed to hold the weight of a world they were too young to fully understand. They're beautiful, he whispered, his voice breaking. They're strong, Sandra replied, her voice softening. But they're growing up in a world that's just as cruel as the one we knew. And they need their father, Robert. Not just in name, but in presence. The conversation stretched late into the night, filled with revelations, accusations, and moments of quiet reflection. Sandra explained the struggles she had faced raising the twins alone, the financial hardships, the racial slurs hurled at them in school, the constant battle to shield them from a society that seemed determined to break them. Robert listened, guilt and anger warring within him. He wanted to blame her for leaving, for keeping their daughters a secret. But deep down, he knew he was as much at fault. He had let his fear dictate his actions, and now, years later, that fear had cost him precious time with his own children. As Sandra stood to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to face him. They'll be in court tomorrow, she said. It's a case about their school, racism, bullying, you name it. They wanted to speak to you themselves, but I thought you should hear it from me first. Robert nodded, his throat too tight to form words. As the door clicked shut behind her, he sat in silence, staring at the photograph of the two girls who, without ever having met him, had already changed his life forever. The courtroom was packed, its air thick with tension. The case of Taylor versus Liberty Heights Charter School had attracted national attention, and for good reason. The plaintiffs were a group of black students and their families, including Sandra Matthews and her twin daughters, who accused the school of fostering a hostile and racially discriminatory environment. The defendants, Liberty Heights Charter, were backed by a network of wealthy donors and powerful political figures determined to preserve their institution's pristine reputation. Judge Robert Wilson, presiding over the case, felt the weight of every gaze on him as he entered the courtroom. This wasn't just another trial, it was a battle for justice in a system designed to maintain the status quo. Robert knew the stakes were high, not just for the plaintiffs but for his own credibility. Every ruling he made would be scrutinized, twisted, and weaponized against him by those who viewed his presence on the bench as an affront to their ideals. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, it became clear just how deep the prejudice ran. The plaintiff's lawyer, Denise Carter, spoke passionately about the years of systemic racism at Liberty Heights, teachers ignoring racist slurs, administrators punishing black students disproportionately, and a curriculum that erased black history entirely. She highlighted the twins' experiences, being ostracized, ridiculed, and physically threatened, all while the school turned a blind eye. The defense, led by an arrogant attorney named Richard Fallon, attempted to dismiss these claims as exaggerated grievances. Fallon, with his slicked-back hair and condescending smirk, referred to the plaintiffs as disgruntled families looking for a payday. He argued that the school's policies were fair and that any perceived disparities were the result of cultural misunderstandings. Robert's jaw tightened as he listened to Fallon's thinly veiled dog whistles. He had seen this tactic before: dehumanize the victims, deflect responsibility, and rely on societal bias to do the rest. The first day of testimony was grueling. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting instances of blatant discrimination. One teacher admitted under cross-examination that she had been told by the principal to keep an eye on black students because they were more likely to cause trouble. A janitor testified that he had overheard staff joking about how those kids will never amount to anything. But the most gut-wrenching moment came when Sandra's twin daughters took the stand. 8-year-old Olivia, her voice trembling but steady, described how her classmates had taunted her with racial slurs and how, when she told her teacher, she was told to stop being so sensitive. Her sister, Maya, recounted being shoved into lockers and having her lunch thrown in the trash by older students. "Did anyone help you?" Denise Carter asked gently. Maya shook her head, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "No. They said it was just kids being kids." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the girl's words hanging heavy in the air. Robert fought to maintain his composure, his heart breaking for the two children who had endured so much. He couldn't help but think of how their experiences mirrored his own as a young boy, fighting to be seen and heard in a world that refused to acknowledge his humanity. As the trial progressed, the defense's strategy grew more desperate. Fallon attempted to discredit the plaintiffs by digging into their personal lives, painting them as overly emotional or financially motivated. When Sandra took the stand, he implied that she was using her daughter's experiences to gain attention. Robert's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Fallon," he said firmly, "this line of questioning is irrelevant. Please return to the matter at hand." Fallon smirked but complied, his tone dripping with mockery as he continued. Robert knew he had to remain impartial, but every word out of Fallon's mouth tested his patience. Outside the courthouse, the case had become a flashpoint for heated protests. On one side, activists rallied in support of the plaintiffs, chanting for justice and holding signs that read, "Education without discrimination" and "Protect our children." On the other side, counter-protesters waved Confederate flags and signs accusing Robert of being a biased judge. The media frenzy added another layer of pressure. Every ruling, every comment, and every expression Robert made was dissected on national television. Some commentators accused him of favoritism toward the plaintiffs, while others praised his integrity in the face of relentless scrutiny. The turning point came when Denise Carter introduced a damning piece of evidence: a series of internal emails between Liberty Heights administrators. The emails detailed discussions about how to handle complaints from black families, including suggestions to label outspoken parents as troublemakers and dismiss their concerns as baseless. One email, written by the principal, chillingly stated, "We can't let these people dictate how we run our school." The defense scrambled to discredit the emails, claiming they were taken out of context. But the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the implications of the evidence sank in. In his closing argument, Denise Carter spoke directly to the heart of the matter. "This case isn't just about Olivia and Maya Matthews or the other children who have suffered in silence," she said. "It's about the kind of future we want to build, a future where every child, regardless of the color of their skin, has the right to learn in an environment free from hatred and discrimination." Fallon's closing argument, by contrast, was a masterclass in deflection and denial. He warned the jury about the dangers of overreach and accused the plaintiffs of seeking to punish an entire institution for a few isolated incidents. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, the foreperson returned, handing a piece of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Robert. As he read the verdict, Robert's voice was steady, but inside, his emotions churned. The jury had found in favor of the plaintiffs, awarding them damages and ordering Liberty Heights Charter School to implement sweeping reforms. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and outrage. Robert banged his gavel, restoring order, but inside, he felt a flicker of hope. Justice, though imperfect and hard-fought, had prevailed. That evening, as Robert left the courthouse, he found himself face to face with a small group of counter-protesters. One man spat on the ground in front of him. "You'll regret this, Judge," he snarled. Robert held his head high and kept walking. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of progress. The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. The familiar hum of whispered conversations and shuffling papers was replaced by a thick tension that hung in the air. Judge Robert Wilson adjusted his robe, his mind focused on the final day of the Taylor vs. Liberty Heights charter school case. After weeks of grueling testimony, this trial, which had exposed systemic racism and corruption, was nearing its conclusion. The plaintiffs were seated to the left, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Sandra Matthews and her twin daughters, Olivia and Maya, sat among them, their presence having become a symbol of the fight for justice. To the right sat the defense, their polished attorney, Richard Fallon, looking as confident as ever, though his sharp eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Robert cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. "We will now proceed with closing remarks from both parties. Ms. Carter, you may begin." Denise Carter, the plaintiff's fiery attorney, rose to deliver her final argument. Her voice was steady and passionate, weaving together weeks of testimony into a compelling narrative of injustice. As she spoke, Robert's gaze wandered briefly to the back of the room, where the twins sat with Sandra. Their wide, curious eyes locked with his for a fleeting moment, sending a strange pang through his chest, something he couldn't quite place. As Denise concluded, the defense took the floor, Fallon once again leaning into his strategy of deflection and denial. His words dripped with condescension as he accused the plaintiffs of exaggerating their claims and warned against allowing emotions to cloud judgment. Robert remained impassive, though his hands gripped the edge of his bench tighter than usual. When Fallon sat down, Robert nodded and prepared to adjourn for deliberations. But before he could speak, Olivia and Maya suddenly stood up, their small forms instantly drawing the room's attention. Gasps rippled through the audience as the girls walked to the center of the courtroom, their movements deliberate and unflinching. Sandra reached out to stop them, her face pale with shock, but they slipped past her grasp. Robert frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Young ladies, this is highly inappropriate. You must return to your seats." But Olivia, the braver of the two, spoke up, her voice clear and unwavering. "We can't wait anymore." Maya nodded, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We have to tell you the truth." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and Fallon shot to his feet, his face a mixture of irritation and confusion. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Robert silenced him with a sharp look. "Mr. Fallon, sit down." Turning his attention back to the girls, he softened his tone. "What truth are you referring to?" The twins exchanged a glance, as if drawing strength from each other. Then, in unison, they said the words that would change everything. "We are your daughters." The room exploded into chaos. Gasps, whispers, and shouts of disbelief filled the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, and even the court officers seemed momentarily frozen. Robert's mind raced, the words echoing in his head as if time had slowed. He felt the world tilt beneath him. What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia stepped forward, her small frame radiating a quiet courage. "You're our father," she repeated, her voice steady. "Sandra is our mom. She told us everything." Robert's eyes flickered to Sandra, who sat with her head bowed, her hands trembling in her lap. She wouldn't look at him. "Order!" Robert bellowed, slamming his gavel down. "I will have order in this courtroom." The crowd quieted, but the tension was palpable. He turned back to the girls, his heart pounding. "This is neither the time nor the place for such claims. I don't understand." "How?" Sandra finally stood, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Robert, it's true," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "They're yours. I didn't know how to tell you before, and then it was too late." The weight of her confession hit him like a tidal wave. Memories he had buried for years came rushing back: Sandra's laughter, the late-night conversations, the bitter fight that had driven them apart. He looked at the girls again, really looked at them, and saw pieces of himself staring back. The curve of their smiles, the determination in their eyes, it was unmistakable. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The courtroom blurred around him, the voices of the spectators fading into background noise. All he could hear was the sound of his own heart pounding. Fallon, ever opportunistic, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Surely this is some kind of stunt to disrupt the trial." "Enough, Mr. Fallon," Robert snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. "You will not speak out of turn." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control. "This matter is personal and has no bearing on the case at hand. We will address it outside this courtroom." His words were firm, but his voice cracked slightly under the weight of his emotions. Turning to the jury, he said, "We will recess for deliberations. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Robert remained seated, his hands gripping the bench. He watched as Sandra guided the twins out of the room, their small figures dwarfed by the towering walls. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly unmoored, the foundation of his carefully constructed world shaken to its core. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary trial. Justice, in its purest sense, was no longer confined to the law. It had stepped into his personal life, demanding answers, reconciliation, and a reckoning he hadn't been prepared for. The relentless coverage didn't just amplify the public outcry, it fed it. Every detail of Robert's past was dragged into the spotlight, often distorted to fit a narrative of failure and scandal. The same outlets that had celebrated his appointment to the bench now framed him as a liability, a man whose personal life was too messy for the dignity of the court. One particularly scathing editorial read: "Judge Robert Wilson's courtroom has become a circus, and the blame lies squarely on his shoulders. While his personal challenges may evoke sympathy, they have no place in our judiciary. It's time for him to step aside for the good of the system." Robert read the piece in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. The implication was clear: his blackness, his personal struggles, and now his daughters were all being used to discredit him, not because of his competence, but because of what he represented. Amid the chaos, a few voices rose in his defense. Civil rights leaders and legal scholars publicly condemned the attacks, pointing out the racial double standards in the criticism. "Let's be clear," said Dr. Evelyn Harris, a prominent activist, during a televised interview. "If Judge Wilson were a white man, this would be a personal matter, not a public scandal. What we're seeing is not just a backlash against him as an individual, it's a backlash against what he stands for: progress, representation, and justice." But even these words of support were drowned out by the louder, angrier voices demanding his resignation. The mounting pressure took its toll on Robert. He found himself second-guessing his every decision on the bench, wondering if his rulings would be seen as impartial or as a desperate attempt to prove his integrity. At night, he barely slept, haunted by the faces of his daughters and the question that gnawed at him: had he failed them by allowing them into his world? The twins, for their part, tried to stay strong. But one evening, Maya approached him, her eyes red from crying. "Do you wish we hadn't said anything?" she asked quietly. Robert knelt down, looking into her tear-filled eyes. "No, sweetheart," he said firmly. "I don't regret the truth. And I'm proud of you both for having the courage to speak it. This isn't your fault. It's theirs, the people who can't stand to see justice or love win." As the days turned into weeks, the backlash showed no signs of abating. But Robert refused to step down. He began speaking out, not to defend himself, but to address the larger issues at play. In interviews and public statements, he called out the racism and hypocrisy that had fueled the attacks. "I am a judge," he said in one televised address, his voice steady despite the storm around him. "But I am also a father, a man, and a Black American. These things do not make me less impartial, they make me human. And I will not apologize for my humanity." The fight was far from over. But Robert Wilson had faced adversity before, and he knew that the only way to overcome it was to keep moving forward, one step, one case, and one truth at a time. The weight of the past few weeks was suffocating. Robert Wilson sat in the dimly lit room of his private office, the hum of his computer the only sound cutting through the thick silence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to type. The public backlash, the constant threats, the media frenzy, it was all overwhelming. Yet amid the chaos, something had been eating at him, something he couldn't shake, the suddenness of the confession in the courtroom. He knew, deep down, that Olivia and Maya's revelation had been a catalyst for something much bigger, but there was a shadow hanging over it. A question that gnawed at him: who orchestrated this? Why now? With a deep breath, Robert turned away from his desk and picked up the phone. He had to know the truth. The next morning, Robert met with his trusted investigator, Lucas Harris. Lucas had been with Robert since his early days on the bench, and his loyalty was unmatched. They'd dealt with their fair share of threats and intimidation over the years, but this felt different. This was personal. "Have you found anything?" Robert asked, his voice low and strained. Lucas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been digging into the details surrounding the confession in the courtroom. Something doesn't add up, Robert. I think this is more than just a personal revelation, it was a setup." Robert's pulse quickened. "A setup? How?" Lucas slid a file across the desk. "Take a look at this." Inside the file were records of several key figures tied to Liberty Heights Charter School, the institution at the heart of the trial, and, more importantly, a list of individuals who had made discreet financial contributions to its legal defense. At the top of the list was George Bradford III, the same corporate tycoon behind the school's board and a man with deep ties to local political figures. Lucas continued. "Bradford's name keeps popping up. And it's not just his money that's at play here. There's someone else pulling the strings, someone who stands to gain more from this scandal than anyone else." As Lucas continued to lay out the web of connections, Robert's suspicion grew. The conspiracy wasn't just about discrediting him, it was about something much larger. George Bradford, the steel magnate who had once been an adversary in one of Robert's most controversial cases, was connected to a network of powerful figures. Through his wealth and influence, Bradford had long manipulated the judicial system, and he had many allies in the political and corporate spheres. Robert's mind raced. Bradford had never been shy about his disdain for Robert's rise to power, nor his belief that black judges like Robert were a threat to the established order. But Bradford had always been careful to keep his distance. To keep things official. Until now. "You're saying Bradford orchestrated the girl's confession?" Robert asked incredulously, feeling a surge of anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm not saying he did it directly," Lucas replied, "but he certainly stands to benefit. And there's more." He handed Robert a series of emails. They were dated just a week before the trial, and though they appeared to be from a secondary source, they had been forwarded to key figures within Bradford's circle. The subject: Judge Robert Wilson's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The emails contained personal information about Robert's past, details about his estranged relationship with Sandra, his early life, and even his financial struggles, all framed as liabilities that could be exploited. Robert felt a cold chill spread through him as he read the words. These were the same tactics used to undermine his credibility throughout the trial, the same words that had been echoed by his opponents in the media. This was no coincidence. Someone had been carefully constructing a narrative of Robert as an unfit judge, someone eager to destroy him at all costs. But who? The breakthrough came when Lucas managed to trace the emails back to a source within the school's administration, Judith Ellis, the head of the school's public relations department. Judith Ellis? Robert muttered, frowning. He remembered her, an articulate, poised woman who had always maintained a professional distance during the trial. She had been the school's spokesperson, handling the media in the aftermath of the accusations. But there had always been something about her that Robert couldn't quite place. Her calm demeanor felt rehearsed, too controlled. "She's the one who leaked this stuff," Lucas confirmed. "She's connected to Bradford's people, and from the looks of it, she's been feeding them information for months." Robert's heart sank as the pieces fell into place. Ellis had been a quiet, calculating presence throughout the trial, working behind the scenes to manage the school's public image. But now, it seemed she had been playing both sides, gathering intel on Robert's weaknesses and exploiting them to further the agenda of those who wanted him removed from the bench. But there was still one critical piece missing: why bring Sandra and the girls into it? Why would they be involved in a plot so deeply tied to Robert's downfall? Lucas flipped through his notes and paused on a single line. "There's something else I found. Remember the timing of the girls' confession, the way they stood up in court at the exact moment when everything was starting to lean in your favor? Well, it turns out the twins had been speaking to Judith Ellis long before the trial." Robert stared at him, his mind spinning. "What do you mean? You're saying she coached them?" "I'm not sure yet," Lucas said, his voice grim. "But Sandra Matthews was in contact with Ellis. And from what I can gather, Ellis convinced her that speaking out publicly would be the best way to help Robert's image. The girls, naive as they were, didn't understand the full scope of what they were being used for. The truth, Robert realized, was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The confession, which had seemed so personal, so raw in its emotion, was in fact a carefully constructed maneuver. Sandra, unknowingly or not, had been manipulated by Ellis to set the stage for the downfall of Robert's career. The goal was never just to destroy his credibility, it was to dismantle everything Robert stood for: his fight for justice, his defiance of the system, and the threat he posed to those who controlled the power in this city. The deeper conspiracy went beyond Robert, reaching into the very heart of the local political and judicial system. Bradford, Ellis, and others had plotted to use his personal life as a weapon against him, hoping to force him into submission, or better yet, force him out of his seat of power. But Robert wasn't ready to give up just yet. The fight for justice had only just begun. Olivia and Maya Matthews had never known an easy life. Born into a world that seemed determined to break them before they could even stand, the twins quickly learned that survival meant fighting every day, against poverty, against prejudice, against a society that saw their existence as an inconvenience. The small, run-down apartment they called home was a testament to their mother's resilience. Sandra Matthews worked tirelessly to keep the lights on and food on the table, juggling multiple jobs as a cleaner and a waitress. But no amount of hard work could shield the girls from the harsh realities of their world. From a young age, Olivia and Maya were keenly aware of how different they were treated compared to their peers. At school, teachers ignored them unless they were in trouble. Other children, emboldened by their parents' whispered prejudices, hurled cruel words at them: dirty, lazy, unwanted. These taunts cut deep, but what hurt more was the silence of the adults who stood by and did nothing. The twins often relied on each other for comfort. Olivia, the bolder of the two, would stand in front of her sister, shielding Maya from the worst of the bullying. "Let them try," she would say, her small fists clenched. "They can't hurt us if we don't let them." Maya, quieter and more introspective, found solace in drawing. Her notebooks were filled with sketches of a world far removed from their own, a place where the streets were clean, the homes were warm, and people treated them with kindness. It was a dream, one she shared with Olivia late at night when they whispered under the covers, imagining a life where they weren't constantly fighting to be seen. Things grew worse as they got older. By the time they were 8, the twins had already witnessed more than most children ever should. They had seen Sandra cry in secret, her shoulders shaking as she tried to muffle her sobs. They had watched as bills piled up on the kitchen table, marked with red stamps that spelled out, "Final Notice." They had felt the sting of humiliation when Sandra had to beg for an extension on their rent, only to be met with condescension from the landlord. The final straw came one afternoon at school. Maya had been shoved into a locker by an older boy who called her a slur, laughing as she crumpled to the floor. When Olivia confronted him, she was dragged to the principal's office and suspended for aggressive behavior. Sandra, furious, marched into the school to demand answers, but she was met with cold indifference. "They're just kids," the principal said dismissively. "Maybe you should teach your daughters how to get along with others." That night, as Sandra tried to console her daughters, Olivia looked up at her with tear-streaked cheeks and said, "It's not fair, Mama. Why does no one care about us?" Sandra had no answer. The idea to confront Judge Wilson came from a place of desperation. Sandra had always known the truth about Robert, but she had kept it from the girls, fearing the chaos it would bring. But after years of watching her daughters suffer, she decided they deserved to know where they came from. Olivia and Maya were initially hesitant. They didn't know much about their father, other than what Sandra had told them. He was a judge, a man of principle, someone who had fought against injustice his whole life. But the idea of meeting him, of forcing him to acknowledge their existence, lit a fire in Olivia's heart. "We deserve to be seen," Olivia said firmly. "If he's really our father, then he has to care." Maya wasn't as convinced. "What if he doesn't want us?" she asked softly, her eyes downcast. Olivia reached for her sister's hand. "Then we'll make him see us. No one else ever has, but he will." Their bold confrontation in the courtroom had been terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, the twins felt as though they had taken control of their own narrative, forcing the world to acknowledge them. But the aftermath was far more brutal than they had anticipated. The media painted them as pawns in a larger scheme, accusing Sandra of manipulating them for financial gain. At school, the bullying escalated. Some parents went as far as to demand their expulsion, claiming the twins were a disruption. Even in their own neighborhood, they were met with hostility. A neighbor who had once babysat them refused to even look at them anymore. The worst came one night when they were walking home from the corner store. A group of teenagers cornered them in an alley, their faces hidden behind masks. "Think you're special now, huh?" one of them sneered. Before the girls could respond, the teenagers shoved them to the ground, stealing their groceries and leaving them bruised and frightened. When they returned home, Sandra was beside herself with worry. But as she bandaged their cuts, Olivia looked up at her with fierce determination. "We're not giving up, Mama. They can't scare us into hiding." Despite everything, the twins refused to back down. They began attending the protests outside the courthouse, standing among those who supported Robert and holding signs that read, "We are his daughters," and "Justice for all kids." Their bravery inspired others, including children who had faced similar struggles. Through it all, they clung to each other and to their mother. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: Olivia and Maya Matthews were fighters. They had been forged in the fire of adversity, and no amount of hatred or prejudice could extinguish their spirit. Their story was far from over, but for the first time, they felt something they hadn't known in years: hope. The courtroom was silent as Judge Robert Wilson rose from his bench. The trial that had dominated headlines for weeks was over, and the jury's verdict had brought justice for the plaintiffs. But this moment wasn't about the case, it was about something far more personal. Robert stepped down from the bench and walked toward the back of the courtroom, where Olivia and Maya stood with Sandra. For weeks, he had wrestled with the revelation of their existence, torn between his duty to the law and the sudden, overwhelming reality of being a father. Now, as he stood before them, his heart ached with a mixture of regret, love, and determination. He knelt to meet the twins at eye level, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the time we lost, for not being there when you needed me. But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you now." Tears filled Olivia's eyes, but her usual boldness remained. "Do you mean it? You're not going to leave us?" Robert nodded, his own tears streaming down his face. "I'll never leave you again." Maya, who had been quiet, suddenly threw her arms around him. Olivia followed, and for the first time, they embraced as a family. The courtroom, filled with reporters, spectators, and supporters, erupted into applause. It was a rare moment of unity, a symbol of what could be achieved through love and forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Robert faced the daunting task of rebuilding his reputation. But instead of retreating, he used the backlash as a platform. He began speaking openly about the systemic racism that had fueled the attacks against him and the discrimination his daughters had endured. His honesty and vulnerability resonated with millions. Robert launched initiatives to reform education and the judicial system, focusing on creating equal opportunities for marginalized communities. He worked tirelessly, not just for Olivia and Maya but for every child who had been told they didn't matter. His courtroom became a symbol of justice, a place where the powerful were held accountable and the voiceless were heard. 1 year later, Robert stood on a stage with Olivia and Maya at his side. They were at a rally celebrating the passage of new anti-discrimination legislation inspired by their story. As he looked out at the crowd, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Change isn't easy," he said, his voice steady. "But together, we can build a world where every child, regardless of who they are, knows they're valued. A world where justice truly belongs to all of us." The applause was deafening. Olivia and Maya smiled up at him, their faces glowing with pride. They had fought for their place in his life, and together, they had changed the world. From what city are you watching this story? Share in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us keep sharing the truth.